Pro-life talk. Real world answers. This is Life Report.
Welcome to Life Report. I'm your host, Josh Brom. I'm here with my good friend, Dr. Rich Poupard, who's a board-certified oral and maxillofacial surgeon and speaker for Life Training Institute. It's been a long time since you were on the show, Rich.
Hey, it's been too long, Josh. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for coming back on. I've been wanting to do this show for probably 2.5 years or something like that. I'm so glad we're finally doing it.
It's been a while. I think we're both smarter than we were back then anyway. So.
I sure hope so. If you're not familiar with Life Training Institute, definitely check them out at prolifetraining.com. And there's no one better, I think, for this topic than Rich, because every time someone asks me about the evidence for birth control pills or Plan B and how they work, I'm basically just sending them to the Life Training Institute blog and telling them to search Plan B and just read anything by Serge. And this is the best stuff right now that I think the pro-life movement has. So we have Serge or Rich Poupard, and we have a lot to cover today, so we're going to get right into it. But before we do, I'm going to give this caveat. We are on lots of different mediums. People watch us on YouTube and podcasts and some radio stations, but we're also on a Catholic TV station. And I just want to make the caveat that I always do when we talk about birth control, which is that there is a whole religious discussion and debate that could be had about whether people should be using birth control at all. Should people be planning their families? And there's a lot of discussion between a lot of times Catholic and Protestant friends about that topic. And we are just going to put that entire topic to the side. We are not here to discuss whether or not biblically people should be planning their families, but instead we're going to be talking about how different methods of birth control work and how pro-life people should be talking about them. Do they have an abortifacient effect? What should the public policy discussion look like? And the leadership at KNXT has completely approved this topic. So we're just not going to have the religious debate because I don't want to have it. So instead, Rich, why don't you just talk a little bit about your expertise and why people should take your opinions about birth control seriously?
Well, actually, it's not my opinions that are important. And in terms of how you phrase this discussion, I do think, for instance, that the discussion that we have on whether contraception is ethical in any point is a very good one we should be having. And as a Protestant, I think that Protestants don't talk enough about contraception. I recently had an article in the Christian Research Journal about the Protestant aspect of contraception. But when we talk about whether or not the mechanism of action of how contraceptives work, and more specifically, whether or not contraception, oral contraception, or Plan B emergency contraception acts as an abortifacient, acts via a mechanism that it prevents an embryo, a human life, from implanting, that is specifically a medical question. It doesn't matter what your opinion is on whether it's right or wrong to use, or whether you should, it should be more available, or public policy, whether it should be illegal or not illegal, or that doesn't matter. It's a medical question. And whether or not that birth control pills or emergency contraception acts as an abortifacient or potential abortifacient, it's all done with an evidence. And in my opinion, and in looking at the research as I have seen very little evidence that, for instance, Plan B, the LNG emergency contraception, works via an abortifacient mechanism, meaning that I don't think it has much an effect, or there's not much evidence that it has an effect on the endometrium of the uterus that would not allow a human being to implant if the embryo was there. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. One of the strongest evidence of this right now is that we're finding out the effectiveness of Plan B emergency contraception is far less than we ever thought it was. And to be very simple about it, if it worked via a post-fertilization mechanism, it probably would work better. It doesn't work well at all. So it probably, that's evidence in itself, but there's certainly a lot stronger ones than that.
Well, let's start by talking about that. Let's talk about, before we get to the abortifacient part of that subject, let's talk about whether, I just want to hear what the studies you've read say about the effectiveness of Plan B, period. Does Plan B help prevent pregnancy if you take it after you've had unprotected sex, or does it not? And I also want to hear you talk about the recent study that just came out last week about how it can a woman's weight can actually have a big effect on the effectiveness.
Sure. You go through some history here. Back about 10 years ago when emergency contraception first was introduced, the pro-abortion choice side really thought that this was going to revolutionize things, that the amount of, if we just gave every woman this hormone to take if she had unprotected sex, that we can decrease immensely the number of unplanned pregnancies and thus abortions. And the original studies came out, and it's really complicated about why they made this mistake. They thought it was about 90% effective if taken within the first 72 hours of unprotected intercourse. Well, since that time, they tried to show that they compared populations of women who took emergency contraception versus those that didn't take contraception. And they designed these studies in order to show how effective it was going to be. And what came out was very surprising. It wasn't effective at all on a population level, meaning that if you have a large group of women who took emergency contraception and a large group of women who didn't take emergency contraception after unprotected sex, the pregnancy rates were the same. And that was very surprising back then. This is maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Since that time, they said, well, it can't be 90% effective because it doesn't seem to be working that much. James Trussell, who is one of the leading contraceptive researchers, then claimed that, well, because of the fact that there's really no other option if somebody has unprotected sex, that we're probably a more important consideration, I'm going to read this part, a more important consideration for most ECP clients may be the fact that the data from both clinical trials and mechanisms of action clearly show that at least the LNG regimen of ECPs is more effective than nothing.
More effective than nothing.
Yeah. So and we knew that 5, 6 years ago. We don't know how effective it is, but it's probably better than nothing. Well, it turns out just this week that for many, many women, that's actually not true. We found out it is actually not more effective than nothing. It actually is not effective at all. The recent study just showed that this is a study from 2 years ago. And once again, the contraceptive researchers have known this for a while, but it just wasn't really publicized. But that if women are over 176 pounds, that in fact there's no effectiveness at all to the emergency contraception, the Plan B emergency contraception. And if you're over 165 pounds, then you start to lose the effectiveness. So we don't know, it's not zero effective, but we don't know how effective it really is. Now the average weight of a woman in the U.S. is 166.2 pounds. So for the majority of women in the U.S., that it's certainly not nearly as effective, and for many, the effectiveness is actually zero. And by the way, in terms of the minority community, for instance, African American women are the average African American woman weighs more than 176 pounds. Therefore, it's not recommended at all for the majority of that minority group. So once again, we're already finding out that it just was not nearly as effective. The pro-abortion choice side has spent so much time and energy first making it available over the counter, then making it available for teens over the counter without really acknowledging that, well, it's probably not doing any good anyways.
Okay, because I've got several questions, being someone not in the medical community, but when I hear that, okay, first of all, why is Trussell's quote not on the packaging of Plan B? Just so you know, like an advisory, we think this is maybe a little bit more effective than nothing, but it's not 90%. Is that are women being told this? Is there informed consent about that?
Not at all. The package insert has not changed. It still says it's approximately 90% effective.
How is that possible?
The answer is complex. In order to change the packaging on something, you have to bring it to the FDA approval. And because they are not really sure how effective it is, they haven't decided to do that. So, it hasn't been publicized. Nobody's really mentioned it. Even now, you'd think that this news event that it's not effective for women over 177. That'd be a huge sign in Rite Aid or Walgreens that don't take this because it doesn't work. But it's going to take months, if not years, for that change to be made. Unfortunately, the problem is, and the concern that I have regarding this is, women are already now. They're being, instead of taking the LNG, the Plan B emergency contraceptive, they're going to be encouraged to take Ella or do one of the other forms of emergency contraception, either Ella or a copper IUD. Now, we've talked about Plan B, and I do not believe the evidence shows that Plan B works by an abortifacient mechanism. The same cannot be said about those other two contraceptives. An IUD certainly works by an abortifacient mechanism, and it's extremely effective, unlike Plan B, obviously, and it's effective long after ovulation even occurs. So clearly, James Trussell says it almost certainly works after fertilization. Now, Ella is advertised as working primarily by stopping ovulation. However, first of all, to understand what Ella is an analog of mifepristone, of RU486.
Right.
Most of the research that was done with RU486. They marketed Ella, which is ulipriston, in order to avoid the stigma of saying you're taking the abortion pill. But it works the exact same way. There's really no difference in the mechanism. There actually is no difference in the mechanism of action. So they tried to dose it so that it's a smaller dose, certainly, than you take for RU486, and they say, and it does have an effect on ovulation. There's no question about that.
Okay.
However, we also know it has a direct effect on the endometrium in the uterine lining. That's how RU486 works. It's an antiprogestin. It prevents the progesterone from binding in the uterine lining, thus causing an abortion when taking it at large doses. Even at small doses, though, the latest evidence is that it does show thinning of the uterine lining, even at doses given for so-called emergency contraception. So although I've been banging the drum for a while that I don't think Plan B works as an abortifacient, the same cannot be said about Ella. I definitely think that there's a potential for it to be working as an abortifacient. And by the way, Ella will probably never be available over the counter, and they won't push that because there's also no question that if you take enough of it, you can cause a medical abortion. If you are pregnant and you want to get an abortion without anybody knowing about it, and you take enough, it'd be expensive. If you took enough of the Ella medication, it would cause an abortion.
The study that just came out last week, you talked about how pro-abortion choice people have been, really kind of putting a lot of hope and a lot of work into talking about Plan B. Have you? Because I haven't looked yet, but has there been anything from the pro-abortion choice crowd about the weight gain study? Anything on RH Reality Check, or have you noticed anything? Are they talking about this, or are they maybe not wanting to talk about this?
They're starting to talk about it. Although, honestly, if you look at, for instance, if you look at Google News, the amount of press given to this, which is truly a bombshell thing, compared to the amount of press given to it when it was available over the counter and or available to teens over the counter, they had a huge press rush with that. And for this, which is a far more important news event, we've seen very, very little. But they certainly have acknowledged it, James. So this is really disappointing, they basically say. But they are also using it as a means to push women, certainly overweight women, but all women, to start looking at these other types of so-called emergency contraception.
When we were talking about this before we started the show, you actually made a connection that I hadn't thought about between Ella and IUDs and other implantables with Obamacare. Can you go ahead and just kind of fill our listeners in about that?
This is in terms of general contraception. One thing that we haven't really talked about much in the pro-life movement is the effect of Obamacare, as well as some of the latest trends within the contraceptive community. There has been a huge push in the contraceptive community to stay away from things like oral contraception and condoms and diaphragms and things like that, to what's called long-acting reversible contraception, specifically implantable hormonal contraception that lasts from 3 to 4 months, or in IUDs. A lot of especially pushing the IUDs. It used to be that they recommended not having an IUD done unless you've had a previous pregnancy. Now, not so much. They're saying it's safe for even teenagers. Now, the reason why Obamacare affects us so much, if you remember, because of the contraceptive mandate, Obamacare mandates that all FDA-approved contraception can be given without any type of copay. So in other words, the difference between Plan B and Ella, there's a price difference. I think at least $30 price difference that, of course, would discourage women from taking Ella if Plan B would be as effective. Well, now there's no cost issues at all. So now Ella is certainly going to be pushed much more than Plan B would. once again, replacing an abortifacient with placing a non-abortifacient with an abortifacient contraception. In terms of oral contraception, we're going to have all of these teenagers. Remember, there is, because of privacy laws and things like that, that parents don't know or aren't aware when kids are able to go into these Title X clinics to receive any kind of contraceptive advice. Now, instead of getting a prescription for contraception, these 14, 15, 16-year-olds are going to be fitted with IUDs that are supposedly more effective in terms of preventing unplanned pregnancy, but I think could have considerable risks in the future. It's one thing to take a medication that you can stop at any time. It's another thing to implant a device in a teenager's body, which is designed to affect the uterine lining over a period of time, as well as, at least in terms of the Mirena, the one type of IUD, have hormones that will affect her periods, and have it sit there for up to 10 years. Secondly, even now, most teens, when they're given contraceptive devices, talked about, all of the oral contraception doesn't do anything for sexually transmitted infections. And the advice is to use a condom as well as other types of contraception. Now, with these implantable contraceptives, which are being very encouraged and pushed on our teenagers without any benefit of parental advice, that the risks of STIs and the morbidity or the complications of having a sexually transmitted disease when you have, for instance, an IUD implanted is huge. And also, well, remember how the IUD works by being implanted in the uterine wall. And that is, of course, and irritating the uterine lining. That's one of the mechanisms of how it works. Well, now, if you have a sexually transmitted disease on top of that, it's kind of a double whammy. In fact, the recommendation for women at risk for sexually transmitted infections or having a recent sexually transmitted infection to not place an IUD. But nevertheless, I think that's something that we haven't really talked about at all. And I think there's it's one thing to say, and I would certainly strongly argue against the fact that that our 15, 14, 13-year-old daughters should be able to go to a clinic and receive these contraceptives that change their reproductive system without having any type of parental consent is wrong to begin with. But now actually having a device implanted inside of their reproductive tract in order to prevent that from working correctly, and seeing that as a positive healthcare trend. And there's the reason why Obamacare is that before, cost used to be a factor with this. An IUD cost $800 or $900 to place. Well, now, because there's no copay, it's the same price no matter what form of contraception that you choose to have.
The point you're making is that because of Obamacare, people will be more likely to use the more expensive implantables that there's reasons to have more concerns with because they're the same price, meaning free.
Yes, and they are also very much encouraged to do so. In fact, if you looked at the video, I was at the Association for Reproductive Health Professionals, and they actually have videos in which they train their providers to encourage young girls, to choose implantable devices as well as IUDs as opposed to birth control pills. They had a video of a girl coming in and asking for oral contraception, and kind of gently but firmly saying, this is a better option for you because it's the same price. You should do this.
Okay.
And that's going to be a big change.
I think that one of the most important things I can ask you is, how should pro-life people talk about birth control in public, period? This comes up when we go on college campuses. Sure. People are asking us, what do you think about birth control? And I've seen a lot of people give a lot of different types of responses. Knowing everything you know, how would you train pro-life advocates to talk carefully about birth control?
Well, I think a problem with pro-life advocates, and they when we speak of contraception, it ends up just being a big mishmash of stuff. We think contraception good or contraception bad, and I'm a Roman Catholic, so I don't like contraception at all, and it gets all confusing. I break it down into three questions, and these are important questions, but and they influence each other, but I think it's the way of really thinking about it smartly. First of all, what's the mechanism of action? How do the contraceptives work? And of course, the biggest question is whether they cause abortions. Now, that's a medical question. You've got to bring medical evidence to the table for that. How you feel about them ethically doesn't impact it. I mean,
Right.
if Ella causes abortions, then whether I like it or not doesn't really make it cause less or more abortions.
Right.
And we have to be very clear about that. The second aspect is whether it's ethical for anybody to take contraception, and that's a very important topic. Obviously, I wrote an article about that. But it is different than how, for instance, we deal with things medically. And the third way of looking at it is public policy wise. What is the best public policy in terms of contraception? For instance, obviously, when I talk to Roman Catholic friends of mine, they think that artificial contraception is morally unethical, and that's fine. But I do ask them, well, do you think that should make it illegal? The pro-abortion choice side loves to play this game. Say like, oh, he's anti-contraception, therefore he just wants to take it, not have any woman have the choice of contraception. And most people say, well, no. So what is the best choice for contraception? Should we treat contraception like, and what's the impact, by the way, of our public policy over contraception and the impact that we have on our culture as well as our kids? We are now in a position, for instance, with Obamacare, that my child who needs insulin every month, I've got to pay a copay. Something that I have to give her to save her life numerous times a day. That's not covered. However, we now see the idea of a young teenager with a functioning reproductive system as a pathological situation in which we have to prioritize to make sure she gets medication that she doesn't even have to pay a copay for. That's a discussion that we should be having, not necessarily just say contraception bad. And it's very important to separate the idea of contraception versus what abortion is. Abortion is wrong because it takes an innocent human life. We need to focus on that part and not get confused with what are your views about contraception. So if I'm talking to somebody about abortion, and obviously I'm not afraid of talking about contraception, it's what I'm here doing today, I still want to focus on that. If they say, well, what is your policy on contraception? I say, well, whether or not I'm for or against contraception or think it should be placed in the water or think it should be, locked up for anybody to have, how does that change the fact that abortion kills an innocent human person? And kind of go at it from that way.
It sounds to me like you're saying we ought to be talking about three things. There's this medical question, there's an ethical question, and then there's a public policy question. So in the medical question, you're basically saying we should be talking about what the evidence actually shows, and you believe after having looked at all the evidence we have, like things like Plan B might not even have an abortifacient effect, and some things like Ella and IUDs definitely do. So there's this medical question. There's an ethical question about should we be planning our families at all, which is more of the Catholic versus Protestant discussion, although I will say I think Protestants should probably take that question a lot more seriously than they usually do.
Agreed.
And thirdly, the public policy question. Like with that, are you spending a lot of your time on the public policy issue talking about parental involvement, or are there other things that you're also wanting to bring up in the public policy part of the discussion?
Well, I think parental involvement is an important thing. Why is it that for instance, I'm an oral surgeon. I take out teeth every day. Why is it that we need that we as a culture we realize that that children are not adequately equipped to make certain choices as far as their medical lives? They're not equipped to get their ears pierced. They're not equipped to get a tattoo because that's a decision that may affect them in the future. They're not equipped to have a tooth extracted. I have to talk to parents when somebody's 17, but yet we think that they are completely equipped to make the choice to have an implantable contraceptive placed in them at the young age of 14. Why is that? Why is this the great exception to everything? Recently, I've been looking at articles that say that kids between 13 and 17 don't have the brain structure to think logically about a lot of things. This is an argument that's been used to, for instance, say that they shouldn't have the death penalty for kids that age because they just don't, they're emotional thinkers. They just don't have the capacity to really think things out thoroughly. But yet, once again, why is it then that we think it's just completely fine for them to go and take medication that has a profound effect on their bodies without any parental consent? Those are topics I think are important for us to talk about. And as far as other public policy things, as far as the idea that we need to, the problem with teenage sexuality is that we have a lack of availability for thin layers of latex and artificial hormones. And if we just had more of those around where we can pick them up and they'd use them more commonly, then we wouldn't have this problem.
Right.
And it's certainly far more complex than that. Ironically, too, the reason why birth control pills actually work extremely well, they're very effective. The only reason why long-acting contraceptives are being pushed is because women tend to miss them. And so we're saying on one hand that a 15-year-old is responsible enough to make decisions regarding her own sexuality as well as her contraceptive choices, but she's not responsible enough to take a pill every day. Doesn't seem to add up. And why is that? So I think those questions are important.
People can go to prolifepodcast.net and check that out. But what I wanted you to do is I wanted you to give the 60-second version. You get the question point blank. Does Plan B cause an abortion or not? And then we'll spend more time in the bonus audio talking about that.
First of all, we can't say anything definitively because we don't know the exact mechanism of action of any of the contraception. So I cannot say definitively that there is no possible way that Plan B could ever cause an abortion. At the same time, I can also not say definitively that the Diet Pepsi that my wife just drank a few minutes ago also could not cause an abortion. So we got to be careful on what we can say definitively. In my review of the evidence, I've seen no evidence that Plan B, taken in doses in which is given for emergency contraception, has an effect on the endometrium that would cause an embryo not to implant. At the same time, like I said, I think the more important point is that I am also not convinced that at doses given for Plan B and when it's usually taken, it has much of an effect on pregnancy at all. So, and I think that's been kind of borne out. So that's what I would say. I think the evidence is not there that it does. But that could change. But right now, I'm not convinced it has an effect on the endometrium that would cause an embryo not to implant.
So Rich Poupard is a board-certified oral and maxillofacial surgeon and speaker for Life Training Institute. You can check them out at prolifetraining.com. Rich, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
It's been a pleasure, Josh. Thanks so much for inviting me.
And remember, you can have a great impact on any conversation if you remember to ask good questions, listen to understand, and find genuine common ground when possible. That's our show. Have a great week. Now go talk to someone.
You've been watching Life Report, Pro-Life Talk, Real World Answers. Life Report is produced by Right to Life of Central California. Visit their website at fresnoprolife.org.